What if the person you trusted the most was quietly building a life behind your back with the one you loved? My name is Gabriel Cortez. I am 54 years old, a builder by trade and by heart. For over 2 decades, I believed in hard work, loyalty, and keeping your word. I built a business from nothing. I built a home filled with laughter. And I believed I had built relationships strong enough to last a lifetime. But betrayal does not always come crashing through the front door. Sometimes it tiptoes in through familiar voices, a friend offering help, a partner growing distant. And before you know it, the walls you trusted are hollow. This is not just a story of a marriage gone wrong. It is about the quiet unraveling of trust and how one man responded, with precision, not rage. If you have ever been deceived by someone who should have protected you, or had to rebuild from what others tried to destroy, this story is yours too. Stay with me. And if anything, in this story strikes a chord, leave a comment below, because silence can isolate, but sharing has the power to rebuild. After the first crack appears, you rarely notice the full collapse until it's already in progress. That was my life with Isabella. From the outside, everything seemed strong, stable. I was the founder and CEO of Derrick Projects, a company I started with little more than grit, secondhand tools, and a vision. We specialized in eco-friendly infrastructure, solar-ready homes, green schools, low-impact urban roads. Over 2 decades, we became one of the most respected construction firms in the region. And alongside me, always, was my wife Isabella, a far city planner known for her sharp insight and calm demeanor. She was elegance where I was raw effort, grace where I was grounded. We complemented each other in ways I thought were unbreakable. Then there was Derrick, ex-Marine, steady hands, cool head, my right-hand man since the early days. He came on board when we were nothing more than a concept and helped me turn blueprints into buildings. Together, we rebuilt entire neighborhoods after flood damage in the southern part of the city. I trusted Derrick with my company, my projects, and my personal life. He was there when Isabella and I bought our first home, when our daughter Mia was born, and even when I had surgery 3 years ago. He drove me to the hospital and stayed until the anesthesia wore off. I thought of him as family. We were a trio that worked, on paper and in real life. People envied us. Clients commented on how solid our team seemed. What they didn't see were the micro-fractures forming behind closed doors. I can't say exactly when Isabella started to pull away. Maybe it began the summer I was working 16-hour days trying to win the West Park Transit project. Or maybe it was even earlier, when our daughter left for college and the house fell quiet, but the signs were there. She stopped asking how my day went. Her phone, once left charging in the kitchen, was now always in her pocket. And when I'd catch her looking at the screen, she'd tilt it away. She began volunteering on Thursday nights at an urban sustainability center, a group she'd never mentioned before but now was suddenly passionate about. I was glad she had found something she enjoyed, but something about the way she guarded her time. It felt different. Off. At the same time, Derrick started dropping by our house more often. Just needed to get some files signed, he'd say, or wanted to run an idea past Isabella about that zoning policy update. It made sense, on the surface. Her expertise in urban planning had helped Derrick navigate complicated regulations more than once. But the frequency of those visits, the familiarity in their conversations, the quiet laughter I sometimes overheard as I came in from late meetings, it all started forming a pattern I didn't want to admit was there. Still, I didn't confront either of them. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was projecting my exhaustion and growing dissatisfaction at home onto 2 people who had never given me reason to doubt them. After all, Isabella had stood by me when the company was hemorrhaging money in year 2. She worked overtime just to cover our mortgage when we were too proud to ask for help. And Derrick had passed on a government job just to stay with me when Derrick needed rebuilding after a failed expansion into New Mexico. These were people who had shown loyalty, hadn't they? But even loyalty has limits, and blind trust is just that, blind. Then came the night that changed everything. It was a Tuesday, late spring. I remember because I had just come from a successful pitch meeting with the city council. We were shortlisted for a massive green corridor project. I picked up Isabella's favorite takeout on the way home and planned to celebrate, to reconnect, to remind her, and maybe myself, what we still had. The house was quiet when I walked in. Not peaceful. Unnaturally quiet. Her car was in the driveway. Derrick's wasn't. But the lights were on in the living room, and 2 wine glasses sat on the coffee table. I called her name. No answer. Then, I noticed Derrick's leather folder on the armchair, the one he always carried with him for site visits. My chest tightened. I took a step back and saw a phone screen light up on the kitchen counter. It wasn't mine. It wasn't hers. It was his. A message preview flashed before disappearing. That moment on the couch, I can't stop thinking about it. I didn't pick it up. I didn't shout. I didn't storm upstairs. I stood still. And in that stillness, everything I'd built, the trust, the brotherhood, the marriage, shifted. Not shattered. Not yet. But shifted in a way that I could never. And see, that's when I knew the betrayal was real. And it had started long before that message. I didn't confront them that night. I simply left. And in that silence, I made a decision. I wasn't going to fight with fire. I was going to respond with strategy. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my truck for hours, parked near the trailhead outside town, watching the sun rise, without feeling its warmth. Something inside me had gone quiet. Not numb, not broken, just quiet. It's a strange thing, realizing that the people you protected, the ones you bled for, the ones you trusted with your name and your future, had been lying to your face while pretending to hold your back. There's grief, yes, but beneath it, there's clarity. A cold, focused clarity. The next morning, I got dressed like it was any other workday. I walked into the TerraCore office, nodded to the receptionist, greeted the project leads, and locked myself in my glass-walled corner office. I didn't call Derrick, I didn't text Isabella, I didn't say a word. I needed time to think, not emotionally, but strategically. Because that's how I'd built everything. Not on reaction, but on planning. Not on chaos, but on structure. I knew if I let the betrayal guide my actions, I'd lose. And I had no intention of losing. Not my business, not my dignity. And definitely not to the 2 people who had mistaken my silence for weakness. I began by pulling out our original operating agreement, the one Derrick and I signed over bourbon and optimism 12 years ago. It had been drafted by a corporate attorney named Camila Ortega, a sharp, quiet woman who never smiled much but always thought 3 steps ahead. I hadn't spoken to her in years, but I still had her number saved. She answered on the second ring. I need to activate Article 9, I said, keeping my voice low. There was a pause, then. Conduct detrimental to the company's integrity. Do you have proof? Not yet, I said. But I will. Camilla's voice didn't waver. Then we proceed carefully. Document everything. Keep him close until you're ready. That was the first step. I spent the next 2 weeks pretending nothing had happened. I smiled in meetings. I shook Derrick's hand during job site inspections. I even brought home flowers for Isabella, watching as guilt flickered across her face like a shadow. It wasn't about reconciliation. It was about position. I needed them both relaxed, unaware, believing that their deception had gone unnoticed, because people get sloppy when they think they've won. Meanwhile, I started digging, quietly, methodically. I reviewed Derrick's expense reports from the past 18 months. I flagged inconsistencies, double charges for crane rentals, gas, receipts that didn't match route logs, payments to vendors that didn't exist in our master list. I built a folder, labeling every transaction, every questionable invoice. By the end of the week, I had uncovered nearly $84,000 in misallocated funds. It wasn't just betrayal, it was embezzlement. But money alone wouldn't be enough to trigger Article 9. I needed to tie it to personal misconduct. And so one night, while Isabella slept beside me as if nothing had changed, I did what I had never done in nearly 20 years of marriage. I opened her phone. She had no lock on it. Maybe she trusted me that much. Or maybe she was just careless. The messages were still there, dozens of them, some recent, some months old, photos, hotel confirmations, calendar entries marked client, dinner that matched Derrick's schedule. It wasn't just a fling, it was a routine, a pattern, a second life layered beneath mine. I backed everything up, screenshots, location histories, even a voice memo Derrick had sent her late one night. You don't have to go back to him. We could build our own future. Just imagine it. I did. Imagine it. And then I imagined tearing that future apart, brick by brick, contract by contract, until nothing was left of what they had built behind my back. Camilla met me in her downtown office on a Monday morning. I laid the folder on her desk, followed by a USB drive with the files. She reviewed everything in silence. Her face remained unreadable. "Do we have enough?" I asked. She nodded. "More than enough. He's not just in breach, he's a liability. And if your board sees this, you won't need to force him out, they'll demand it." "Then let's prepare the documents," I said. I left her office lighter than I had felt in weeks, not happy, not healed, just realigned. Back at TerraCore, I resumed the performance. Derrick walked in during a planning session later that afternoon, cracking jokes like he hadn't stolen from me and lied to my face. He clapped my shoulder like a brother. I smiled, nodded, and said, "We need to catch up, just the two of us, tomorrow night in my office. There's something big. I want to run by you." He grinned, completely unaware of the storm I was about to bring into his world. Because betrayal may happen in silence. But justice, when it comes, arrives with a signature. The next evening, I arrived at the office an hour early. The building was mostly empty, just the janitorial staff humming through their routines, the faint echo of a vacuum down the hall. I wanted the setting quiet, controlled. I set 2 glasses and a bottle of the same bourbon Derrick and I used to drink back, when we were still building TerraCore from folding tables and blueprint-stained laptops. One final courtesy, one last echo of the man I had once called brother. Then I placed the folder on my desk, centered it, and waited. He arrived right on time, 7 p.m., just like always. Derrick had a way of being consistent when he wanted to impress. He wore his usual flannel shirt, sleeves rolled, sunglasses tucked into the front pocket like he'd just stepped off a job site. He smiled as he walked in like nothing in the world had changed. "What's the big news?" he asked, dropping into the chair across from me. "You got us that city contract?" I didn't answer right away. I poured him a drink. He raised the glass and took a sip. I didn't. Instead, I opened the folder and slid it across the desk. "What's this?" he asked, brows knitting as he flipped it open. "The end," I said calmly. He scanned the first few pages. His eyes moved quickly, then froze. I could see it hit him. The words Article 9, the list of flagged transactions, the screenshots of messages between him and Isabella. He flipped deeper, frantic now, as if the last page might offer a way out. "You've been spying on me," he finally said, voice sharp. "No," I said. "I've been paying attention, something you clearly stopped doing." He tried to chuckle, but it came out dry. "Gabe, this is personal. You're letting your marriage fall apart and dragging the company into it." "I'm not dragging anything. You did. When you took money out of our accounts. When you slept with my wife. When you used company resources to cover for your affair." "It wasn't like that." I leaned forward, my voice low and firm. "Don't insult both of us by pretending it was anything less than betrayal." He stared at me for a long moment, then dropped the act. His shoulders fell, his mouth tightened. "What do you want?" he said, tone flat now. "I want you gone. You'll sign the dissolution papers and sell your shares back to TerraCore at the agreed clause valuation, 25 cents on the dollar." "That's theft," he spat. "No," I said. "That's the price of betrayal. You signed that clause 12 years ago. Camilla advised us both on it. Back then we thought we were protecting the company from drunk driving scandals or lawsuits. Turns out we were protecting it from you." I won't do it, he said, voice rising. You can't make me. I stood slowly, walked to the window, hands in my pockets. I have the board's full support. They've seen the documents. They've read the messages. Every step you take to fight this only drags your name further through the mud. He ran a hand through his hair. This is over a woman? You'd throw everything away over her? This isn't about her, I said, turning to face him. This is about the fact that you, the man I trusted with my company, my family, my life, decided that none of it meant anything. So no, Derrick, I'm not throwing it away, I'm taking it back. His jaw clenched. He stood, knocking over the chair behind him. I built this company too. You're not the only one who sacrificed. Then, you should have remembered that before you stole from it. Before you used it as cover for your lies. You really think people will just side with you? They already have. He looked down at the folder again, his breath coming heavier. The weight of consequence was settling in. He wasn't used to being cornered. He always had an out. Always had my trust to protect him. Not anymore. I walked back to my desk and picked up the pen. You can sign it now, I said, or you can let the lawyers tear you apart piece by piece. But either way, this ends tonight. For a moment, I thought he might lunge across the desk, but then something inside him broke. Not loudly, but visibly. The fight drained from his eyes. He sat back down, picked up the pen, and signed. No apology. No words, just silence, and in that silence I felt no joy, no relief, only resolve. I watched him leave the office, his shoulders hunched under the weight of a future he had ruined with his own hands. And I stayed behind, pouring that untouched bourbon down the sink. Because nothing about this was worth a toast. The revenge wasn't done yet. But the first move was complete. When the door finally clicked shut behind Derrick, I sat in the empty office for a long time. No celebration, no satisfaction, just silence, cold and steady like concrete curing overnight. I had won the first battle, yes, but wars like these don't end with a signature. They end when the damage is fully exposed, when all the hidden rot has been cut away. And I knew, deep down, Derrick hadn't just taken my wife and stolen from our company. There was more beneath the surface, there always is with men like him. Charm and confidence on the outside, corruption beneath. I'd seen it before, in clients who cut corners, in developers who made promises they never intended to keep. But I'd never expected it in someone I considered family. The next morning, I walked into our legal department with Camila Ortega at my side. We met with the board. I laid everything out, Derrick's financial misconduct, his violation of company ethics, and the clause he had just triggered with his signature the night before. Camila explained it all in precise language, but I could see it in their eyes. What mattered more than the legal jargon was that I'd stayed calm. I hadn't caused a scandal. I hadn't shouted, posted, or made it personal. I had handled it like a builder, layer by layer, structurally sound, impossible to ignore. The board voted unanimously to accept the dissolution. Derrick's shares would be bought out at a devalued rate, and he would be removed from all client-facing and internal documentation effective immediately. But I wasn't done. Over the next few days, I began quietly reaching out to every key client Derrick had ever spoken to on behalf of TerraCore. I wanted to hear, in their words, how he had represented our company. Most were polite, some vague, but a few hinted at things that raised the hairs on the back of my neck. Comments about rushed approvals, budget requests that didn't line up, or pressure to go with specific subcontractors. Patterns began to form. Derrick had been leveraging our reputation to cut side deals, inflating project costs, and taking kickbacks on equipment rentals we never authorized. I went back to the finance department, dug deeper. What I found was a system of shadow accounts, payments rerouted through shell companies registered under a holding firm with no employees, no office, just a name on paper. Red Earth Logistics. The registered agent address? A P.O. box 2 towns over. I paid a private investigator to dig further. The results came back 2 days later. Red Earth Logistics was owned by a woman named Teresa Shaw, Derrick's sister. Now it was criminal. Not just betrayal. Not just immorality, Fraud. Federal level, Camila moved quickly. We contacted the district attorney's office and began compiling everything. Every receipt, every invoice, every email that showed Derrick had funneled over $120,000 into Red Earth over the past 3 years. The timing lined up almost exactly with the deterioration of our personal lives. When he began seeing Isabella behind my back, he'd also started stealing from me behind my books. I remember sitting in my office holding the report in my hand, thinking about the man who once helped me fix a water main with nothing but duct tape and stubbornness. The man who toasted my daughter's college acceptance as if she were his own. That man never existed. It had all been a mask. I called Isabella that night, not out of spite but clarity. She picked up on the second ring. "I assume you've spoken to Derrick," I said. Her silence was enough of an answer. "He'll be facing charges, embezzlement, fraud, possibly conspiracy. I thought you should know." She exhaled, long and slow. "I didn't know about the money," she whispered. "No," I said. "You just knew about the betrayal." "Gabriel, this isn't about us anymore," I interrupted. "I'm not calling for closure. I'm calling because your name might come up in the investigation and I want you to be ready." "I never took $1 from the company." "Good," I said. "Then you have nothing to worry about." She didn't respond after that, just hung up. And maybe that was the truest sentence she'd ever spoken. She hadn't taken $1. But she had taken time, loyalty, and the sense of safety I once felt coming home. The next few weeks were a blur of action, legal filings, interviews, statements to auditors. The news hadn't hit the press yet, but people were talking. Employees knew something was happening. Rumors spread, but I didn't confirm or deny. I simply kept showing up, kept steering the company forward. I took extra time walking the sites, checked in with foremen, spoke to engineers directly. I wanted them to know that the ship wasn't just afloat. It was still charting forward, stronger than before. And behind the scenes, I was preparing for the final act. You see, months before any of this happened, Derrick and I had pitched a massive new project together, a sustainable infrastructure redevelopment contract with the city. It was our biggest to date. If approved, it would define the next 10 years of TerraCore's future. At the time, we had submitted the bid under both our names. But now, with his shares dissolved and his misconduct public, I had to act fast to protect that deal from being tainted. I met with the City Planning Commission personally, sat across from them with every document in order, every contingency prepared. I told them the truth, transparently, professionally, that my company had been betrayed internally, but that integrity was still its foundation, that the person responsible had been removed, and measures were in place to prevent it from ever happening again. I left them with my card, my word, and a file of supplemental documents that showed not only our readiness to execute, but our commitment to building something that would last. 3 days later, we got the contract. Derrick lost everything: the shares, the company, the reputation, and when news of the embezzlement broke weeks later, he didn't even bother denying it. He disappeared. Last I heard, he was staying with a distant cousin in Nevada awaiting formal charges. The man who once shook my hand and called me brother was now nothing more than a footnote in the company's legacy. As for Isabella, she moved out of the house shortly after our conversation. We finalized the divorce quickly. The prenup she once called a formality now served its purpose. She walked away with enough to start over, but not enough to continue the life she had built on lies. I stood alone again, but not as a broken man, as a man who had rebuilt, stronger, cleaner, sharper. Because when the structure is compromised, you don't patch it, you demolish what's rotten and rebuild from the ground up. After everything was finalized, the dissolution, the criminal proceedings, the divorce, I expected to feel something dramatic. Relief, maybe. Vindication. Some cathartic rush of justice served. But what I felt was silence. A steady, undramatic quiet that followed me like a shadow. Not empty, not numb, just still. Like the moments after a storm when everything stands. in place again, slightly rearranged. It was in that silence that I started to reflect, not just on what had been done to me, but on what I had allowed to happen. Derrick hadn't taken the company from me. Isabella hadn't stolen my sense of family. I had handed over small pieces of myself, one overlooked behavior at a time, one excuse at a time, until they had more of me than I did. That's the thing about betrayal. It's rarely sudden. It's slow erosion disguised as routine. So I began rebuilding, not the company, that part was already underway, but myself. The first change I made was stepping away from the CEO role. I promoted a woman named Tasha Nguyen, our longtime operations lead, to serve as interim president. She had grit, vision, and loyalty that had never once wavered, even in the chaos. I remained as executive chairman but gave her full day-to-day authority. It wasn't just a reward for her competence, it was a statement that this company, my legacy, wasn't going to live or die by one man's name. TerraCore would become more than a reflection of me. It would reflect the best of everyone who truly believed in it. Next, I took a sabbatical. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I packed my truck, loaded up a few tools, and drove west, through the Utah desert into the mountains of Idaho, until I found a stretch of land near a glacial lake that felt far enough from everything. There was an old carpenter's cabin for sale, half-rotted porch, moss growing on the siding, windows that moaned in the wind. I bought it on the spot. No plans, no permits, just instinct. And for the first time in years, I worked with my hands again. Not for profit, not for approval, just for silence. Each morning, I split firewood before the frost lifted. Midday, I hammered and sanded stripped old boards down to bare grain. I repaired the porch, replaced the roof, installed a solar rig on the backside of the hill. At night, I cooked over fire, listened to the wind, and let my mind settle into something slower, something real. There was no signal, no email, just time. Oddly enough, it was during those quiet days that Isabella reached out again. A letter, handwritten. She said she was sorry, that she'd been chasing a version of happiness that didn't really exist, that she missed what we had, that she thought she knew what she wanted until it all fell apart. I read the letter twice. Then I folded it and placed it in the drawer of the workbench I'd built with my father's old tools. There was nothing cruel in my silence, only clarity. Some things break, some things bend, but some things must be left behind entirely. Derrick never contacted me again. His trial date was set. The evidence was overwhelming. My attorney said he would likely cut a deal and vanish into a lesser life, maybe under a new name. He had gambled everything and lost, not because I hunted him down, but because he thought I wouldn't. He confused kindness for weakness. Back at TerraCore, the company was thriving. Tasha reorganized our hiring structure, diversified our leadership, and landed a new solar contract in New Mexico. I called once a week, checked in, offered advice, but mostly, I let go. And in that letting go, something strange happened. The company grew stronger, not in spite of my absence, because of it. And that was when I finally understood the hardest truth. The things we build are not meant to be cages. They are meant to outlast us, but only if we know when to step away. After 2 months in the mountains, I returned briefly to Denver, not for business, but for Mia, my daughter. She was graduating with her master's in environmental engineering. I sat in the crowd while she took the stage, her eyes scanning the audience until they found mine. She smiled, not just because I was there, but because she saw that I was finally fully present. Later that night, she hugged me and said, "You seem lighter." I just nodded. She didn't need the whole story. She had already lived through its shadows. When we said goodbye, she handed me a gift, a notebook. On the first page, she'd written, "Start something new, but make sure it's just for you this time." I returned to the cabin with that notebook and started sketching. Not buildings, not businesses, just ideas. Things that made no profit, but made sense to the soul. And in that quiet place, with scars fading and strength returning, I began to write the next chapter of my life. Not as a CEO, not as a husband, not as a man wronged, but as a builder again, one who now knew exactly what to protect. One cold morning near the end of fall, I stood at the edge of the lake behind the cabin, the water still as glass. The trees had turned a quiet gold, and frost kissed the edges of every branch. I held a mug of black coffee, staring at the reflection of the man I had become. Not the man who built Terracore, not the man who'd been betrayed, but the man who had outlasted all of it. In the quiet, I no longer needed to replay the past, but I hadn't forgotten it, and I hadn't let go of one last thread, something unfinished. Before I'd left Denver, I'd given Camilla permission to proceed with a private civil suit against Derrick. The criminal charges were moving through the system slowly, as they often do, but I had no interest in just watching him fade away into a lesser life. There was still something else he'd taken from me. Not money, not ownership, but trust from the community we had served. And I wanted that restored completely. The lawsuit wasn't about revenge. It was about precedent. For every small business owner who had ever trusted the wrong partner. For every honest builder who signed a contract in good faith and got burned because someone close turned the ink into poison. I wanted there to be a public, undeniable record, not just of what Derrick had done, but how it had been handled. With evidence. With structure, without chaos. Camilla filed the paperwork while I was still in the mountains. The complaint laid everything bare. The shell companies, the false vendor relationships, the conflict of interest between Derrick and Isabella's consulting work during the bid process for the West Corridor project. The city was mentioned by name. So were the affected clients. And while we didn't seek to punish anyone but him, the ripples from the filing would be felt. That was intentional. Transparency isn't always comfortable, but it's necessary if you want to build something that lasts. 2 weeks later, a local journalist reached out to me. Someone from the Business Ethics Bureau had forwarded her the court documents. She asked for a statement. I gave her one. I don't want to destroy Derrick Shaw. I want to make sure the truth isn't buried. Terracore's reputation was built on honesty. It will remain that way. What happened inside our company won't be hidden. It will be handled. That's the difference between leadership and pride. The article ran under the title, When Loyalty Breaks, the Fall of a Partner and the Strength of What Remains. I didn't ask for it, but I read every word. The community response was unexpected. I received letters, some handwritten, from local contractors, engineers, even past clients. Most of them said the same thing. Thank you. Thank you for not covering it up. Thank you for standing tall when it would have been easier to stay silent. For the first time I realized this hadn't just been about me. My response had echoed. It gave people something to hold on to. A framework for what to do when your foundation cracks. Not to collapse, not to retaliate blindly, but to measure, cut, and rebuild with care. A month later, I returned to the Terracore office just for a day. Not to take over, but to speak. Tasha had organized a company-wide town hall. Over 100 employees packed into the main floor. Some new, some who had been with us since the days of duct-taped desks and coffee-fueled weekends. I stood up front and looked out over the team I had once led and now trusted to lead themselves. I told them the full story, not the rumors, not the headlines, but the truth. I spoke about what trust means, what happens when it's broken, and what it takes to rebuild, not just walls and contracts, but cultures and people. I didn't cry. I didn't dramatize. I just said this. People will fail you. That's life. But how you respond, that's your legacy. When I finished, they stood and clapped. Not because I was perfect, but because I had not disappeared. I had faced the storm and remained standing, not untouched, but unashamed. After the meeting, a young intern approached me, probably no older than 22. She said, I want to start my own firm one day, but after all this, I'm scared. What if I trust the wrong person? I looked at her and said, then make sure the contract is written with wisdom. and your soul stays grounded in your purpose. You can't avoid betrayal, but you can make it survivable. She nodded slowly, as if memorizing every word. I left the building with a calm I hadn't felt in years, not because everything was perfect, but because I had lived the full arc, from loyalty to loss, from silence to strength. And now, I was walking forward without dragging the past behind me. I had not rebuilt the life I once had. I had built something better, something entirely mine. Winter arrived quietly in the mountains. Snow settled slowly across the roof of the cabin, blanketing the trail behind it, softening the sharpness of the past year. I woke early each morning to the sound of wind through the pines and the faint crack of frozen branches shifting in the cold. There was no traffic here, no buzzing phones, no overlapping calendar notifications, just time, honest, unfiltered time. And in that stillness, I began to understand something I hadn't been able to name before. Not in court filings, not in board meetings, not even at the town hall. The real betrayal wasn't just what Derrick and Isabella had done. It was how long I had ignored myself in the process. For years, I had poured myself into building things for others. A company that created jobs, a marriage that provided stability, a partnership based on loyalty. I had constructed everything around me with purpose, but somewhere along the way, I'd stopped asking what I needed, what I wanted, and when the collapse came, it didn't just destroy trust in others. It exposed how little I'd invested in my own inner foundation. That realization didn't come like lightning. It arrived one evening when I was sanding a cedar beam in the back workshop. My hands were steady, my focus clear, and I paused just for a second and thought, not about business or strategy or justice, but about peace. When was the last time I had felt truly at peace with myself? Not proud, not successful, just at ease. The question lingered longer than it should have. That was my answer, so I started doing something unfamiliar to me. Nothing. Some days I would sit by the fire and read. Others I would hike the ridge behind the property until I couldn't hear anything but my own breath. There was no agenda, no deliverables, just space to exist. And that space, little by little, began to fill with clarity. I thought about my daughter Mia, about how much I had missed while building the empire. I thought about how she had grown into someone fierce and wise despite my absence. I thought about my father, long gone now, who once told me, "You'll spend the first half of your life trying to prove yourself, and the second half realizing who you are without needing to." I finally understood what he meant. And oddly enough, I thought about Isabella too. Not with anger, not with regret, but with detachment. She had made her choices. I had made mine. And where they led us no longer mattered. There was no life to reclaim there. Only a lesson I had already learned. One day I received an email from an old client, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. He said he had read the article about Terracore and that he admired how I had handled everything. Then he asked me a question. Would you be interested in mentoring a group of young entrepreneurs who are starting a co-op for sustainable housing in low-income communities? I stared at the screen for a long time. For the first time since all of it, since the lies, the collapse, the lawsuits, I felt a different kind of weight return. Not pressure, purpose. The idea of giving what I had learned, painfully, slowly, to someone else so they wouldn't have to fall the same way. It lit something in me I hadn't felt in years. I replied the same day. That's how the next chapter began. Not with contracts or construction crews, but with conversations. Every week I logged on to Zoom with 5 young builders across the country. They brought blueprints and budgets, but mostly they brought questions. Questions about trust, about leadership, about how to keep your values intact when the money gets big and the pressure gets louder. And I told them everything, not just the wins but the losses, not just the legal strategies but the emotional ones. I didn't need to be in charge anymore. I didn't need the title. What I had now was something quieter but deeper. Influence without ego, presence without performance. And through them, I started to believe in people again, not because they were perfect, but because they were learning out loud just like I had to. They didn't pretend to have it all figured out. They didn't hide from the hard questions. They leaned into them, and I leaned with them. Somewhere along the line, that quiet man in the cabin became something more than a survivor. He became a guide, and in guiding others, I finally returned to myself. I was no longer rebuilding from what I had lost. I was building towards something new, something honest, something unshakable. Spring arrived in soft waves, melting snow, warmer winds, and the first signs of green pushing through the thawed earth. Life in the mountains was no longer just an escape. It had become a rhythm. I no longer counted the days since the betrayal, the lawsuits, or the divorce. Time wasn't something I measured anymore. It was something I moved within without urgency. And in that freedom, something unexpected happened. I began to feel whole again. Not because everything was healed, but because I had stopped needing to be unbroken to move forward. The mentoring program continued to grow. Word spread quietly, naturally, and more young builders, architects, and ethical entrepreneurs began reaching out. I didn't turn any of them away. I just set boundaries. I told each of them the same thing. I'm not here to be your answer. I'm here to make sure you ask the right questions. Some of them wanted shortcuts, others wanted validation, but a few, just a few, wanted to build something real from the inside out. And those were the ones who reminded me of myself at 29, standing in the dust with nothing but blueprints and stubborn hope. One day, while sorting through old documents, I came across a photo, me, Derrick, and Isabella, taken at the TerraCore ribbon-cutting ceremony 12 years earlier. We were smiling, arms linked, believing in something that no longer existed. I stared at that photo for a long time, but I didn't feel pain. I didn't feel hate. I felt distance, like looking at someone else's memory. That version of me had no idea what was coming. But this version, the man holding the photo, knew exactly what he had survived, and more importantly, what he would never tolerate again. I placed the photo in a small cedar box I had carved by hand and stored it on the highest shelf in the workshop, not to bury it, but to mark it. It was a reminder of the difference between what seems strong and what actually is. Betrayal had once cracked my foundation, but it had also forced me to inspect it, strengthen it, rebuild it with intention. Now, every piece of my life, my work, my relationships, my time, was chosen, not inherited. Mia visited that spring. We walked the edge of the lake, drank coffee on the porch, and talked about nothing in particular. At one point, she looked at me and said, "You're not angry anymore. I can see it in your eyes." I smiled, not because she was right, but because she had seen the whole journey. "I'm not angry," I said, "I'm awake." Before she left, she asked if I'd consider writing everything down, not as a memoir, but as a guide, something for others to learn from. I told her I'd think about it. That night, I sat at the workbench with the notebook she gave me months ago. I opened to the first blank page and wrote 7 words. Here's how I took it all back. And with that, I began writing. Not about revenge, but about rebuilding. Not about loss, but about clarity. Not about destruction, but about becoming a man who knows exactly what he stands for. Because in the end, true strength isn't in what you protect. It's in what you rebuild after everything else falls apart. And so, that was the journey. Not of a man who was broken, but of a man who was tested. I didn't just lose a marriage or a business partner. I lost illusions. I lost comfort. But in return, I gained clarity. The kind that only comes when everything you thought was permanent turns to dust and you're forced to ask yourself, what do I really stand on? If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Strength isn't in how loud you fight back. It's in how precisely you respond. With calm. With structure. With values that don't shake just because the people around you do. Not everyone gets a second chance to rebuild. But if you do, build it wiser, slower, stronger. Because the most important thing you'll ever construct isn't your company, your house, or your reputation. It's yourself. And if this story spoke to you, If you've ever been betrayed, underestimated, or had to start again from the rubble, leave a comment below. Your story matters too, and someone out there might need to hear that they're not alone. Let's talk about it. Let's build something real together.